Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I am your host, Michael Manley, and I'm very happy to welcome to this week's episode my friend John McCann, who is president of Partners in Performance. And John is done amazing work with leadership development and consulting with arts and arts organizations, performing arts, as well as museums and other institutions, and is also an educator working now at Duke University in the area of arts leadership development. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you.
You too. And I first met you in the League of American Orchestras Management Fellowship Program, where you were really providing us a lot of guidance in this intensive year-long program, which had us in residence with 4 different organizations. And I just remember learning so much from you about what it means to be a leader, especially in a mission-based field, which is what all I think arts are. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this work?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And again, Michael, I want to thank you for inviting me, and it means a lot. I've been able to listen to a couple of the prior podcasts, and it's been very intriguing, some of the guests you've had and some of what they've had to share. So I'm glad to be included in the mix. My work in this started actually in the nonprofit theater world. I did my undergraduate work in theater and communications. And just a week or so before graduation, this theater company called me and said, the third lead is open because the person we wanted to hire isn't available. Would that be interesting to you? So I got my first acting job literally before graduation. And once I got to that company, realized, though, that management was pretty much non-existent and somebody had to sort of fill in that area. And so I just began doing little things that needed doing, as far as like making sure we had payroll set up and things like that. And so I just migrated from the stage into the office over a 6 or 8 month period. And then for probably 10 to 12 years, I worked as an executive in the nonprofit theater, starting out in the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky, a part of this world that is magically beautiful and rich in culture, and I think often overlooked in that regard. And then moved on to Columbus, Ohio. And then I was in San Diego with the San Diego Repertory Theater for a number of years. And I was not good at that. I can just know that now, that executive leadership was something that I don't know that I have the stamina for, and I don't know if I have just the heart to do the hard work that executive leaders are confronted with day after day after day. And so I got a call and somebody said, would you come and help us have a conversation about things that we're not willing to talk about, but we need to talk about? And so this whole journey of facilitation and consulting began in that way. And so then I have spent the last 30 years sort of on the road and being able to sit in community within organizations to help with a dialogue around issues, around aspirations, around intention, around conflict. And it's been such a learning journey for me. And in that time, I also ran a graduate program at Virginia Tech for a decade, which I learned a lot about academia through that hands-on process. And then I also am the co-founder of EMC Arts, along with my dear friend and colleague, Richard Evans, who sadly passed away earlier this year. So the journey has been just lovely. And at every turn, I've learned new things. And I continue to facilitate and to consult. And we have leadership development programs in the state of Michigan we call Rising Leaders, which is for people a third my age, 25, 26 years old, who come in and really want to sort of investigate what kind of practice is going to make sure that they're effective in the world. So varied and sundry things over the years, but I've enjoyed every step of it.
That's great. And if you had to pick out a few things, like if we have some listeners and watchers who are considering a career in arts management, and maybe they come from a performance background, what are some of the key qualities of a good arts leader in particular, and what makes a high functioning arts organization, I would say?
Yeah, well, three different questions there, but I'll try to tackle at least a couple of them.
Yeah.
First of all, I would be an advocate for anyone who is in the performance domain as a performer, as a generative artist. If you're thinking about moving into administration, do it, because we need your sensitivities and your sensibilities in those executive ranks in the area of fundraising, marketing, productions, finance. So if you're thinking about it, I would urge you to venture into that territory. Some of the things that I know you would bring, again, are those sensibilities as an artist, sensitivities as an artist, which I think organizations need. I think some of the goods that people need to come with include a real caring for organizations as a human community, not as a structure, a real caring for organizations as human communities. That would, I think, first. The second is the job of the organization is to create value for the community in which it finds itself. The job is about the community in which the organization is located and by dint is supported. So the job is to actually create value for the community. And I think the third is the fact that the systems and structures that you find are not the ones that you need to sustain. And if anything, you need to have a high tolerance to risk in finding out new and different structures that are consistent with the kind of the world that is around us now, this sustained uncertainty we find ourselves in. And we need new systems and structures in order to enable organizations to be effective, and hoping they will shift and shape as the world is shifting and shaping around us. So if there's anything you could bring, I think it's those three things, and that would be great.
Yeah, that's really perceptive. And I think I had a friend on a few weeks back who is a licensed therapist now, and was a clarinet player for many years. And I asked him how he could just walk away. So he just completely cut ties with music, just got to a point where he was done. He didn't have any injuries or need. He just was done with it. And he said to me, well, the work I do now is very creative. It's a similar type of creativity. And I think that's often missing sometimes in leadership, is that sense of creativity.
Yes, I agree. And part of that creativity can be creating these new systems and structures, a new way of organizing that is more consistent with I think, with the uncertainty and the dynamism of the world in which we have to function and hopefully flourish. So yes, I think it's a great creative gateway for any individual.
Yeah. And I think I shared with you that there is a mindset difference between leadership and performance. In terms of, in classical music, especially, probably dance is similar, but there's such a high watermark that you're trying to meet as far as your skill mastery, and it's extremely narrow, and it's very risk averse. Like we never want to risk anything when we're performing. We want to make sure that we're as close to perfect as can be. And the world of management is so opposite that, because there's so much uncertainty, there's so many balls in the air, and there's so much that's left undone sometimes at the end of a workday. And do you find that performers who make that shift have trouble with that, or how do they manage that change?
Well, I think the way you've described those two worlds is useful. But one behavior that I think is reinforced by the building of a skill set over a lifetime that is required in both those worlds is that of listening. So in my work in the theater over years, and now working with orchestras and other performing arts organizations, the capacity to listen to the other people in the section, the other people on the stage, the people that Alan Alda said about acting is, if you're going to be a successful actor and you're going to convince the audience of anything, you have to be willing to be totally surprised by what you're going to hear from your colleague on the stage. So you may have rehearsed the lines, but you were listening as you're listening for the first time. So I think this capacity to listen in the ensemble is the same skill that's necessary for people who are in administrative leadership. The capacity to listen, as opposed to guess about what you're going to be hearing. And when you hear something that someone says that is in your staff or on your board or in the community that you disagree with, The job becomes to learn even more about what this person has to offer. So you can actually acknowledge and recognize and begin to interrogate your own beliefs, your own way of seeing the world, because that's the value this other person is providing you. If you can actually listen and listen keenly, listen to what's being said. And I think when you're working across the organization, listen to what's not being said. My friend Alex Sarian gave me that a few years ago. Listen to what's not being said. So this keen capacity to listen, I think, is consistent with artists in an ensemble and leaders in the administrative ranks.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And certainly musicians we listen all of our careers, like that's what we do. So that's a really perceptive way of framing it. So you talk a lot about change and adaptation and coming up with new structures. And I think it's always a good idea, but now that arts organizations and really anybody dependent on a public audience coming out of the pandemic, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing that they're facing and changes that are happening sort of in that whole realm of live delivery of experiences and performance?
Well, I think, again, it's unique organization to organization, but I think one is that rather consistent, and I heard it voiced with such passion and clarity when I was in Syracuse this past week. So Syracuse Stage, magnificent theater company in close association with Syracuse University. So they opened a new musical just a few weeks ago, and 3 days in had to close the show because of COVID. The second lead was positive. The understudy was positive. The show had to close. $140,000 hit on their budget, just like that. So now the next thing they have is their big Christmas offering, which is a $400,000 earned income driver. What if the same thing happens? So I think that's the consistent reality that organizations are wrestling with, is the what if. And I was in a room of 90 people, and although I didn't pose the question, one of the people in the group, and it was artists and staff and board together, said, what if this happens for us with the Christmas production? And there is no answer to that. There is no answer to that, right? There's no expert you can hire. There's no executive who is smart enough to tell you what you will do in that moment. So it's living with that kind of anxiety, I think, that is consistent across organizations. And I heard somebody say it a few weeks ago, why can't we just settle in to the fact it's all going to be unsettled for a good while? And there's something about the accepting of that, of settling into the fact that it's going to sustain in this unsettled state for a good while. Political polarization, the economy, health, just the general way that the world is working right now creates, I think, high levels of fatigue because we've been at it for 3 years, high levels of anxiety. And living in this world of sustained uncertainty means that we need to work with one another in very different ways, caring for one another, being patient with one another, listening to one another, actually supporting one another within these spaces where we want to create great work on behalf of the community. So I think the whole idea of the way we relate to one another is one way to sustain ourselves through this period of great anxiety. But what we're going to do when, if we lose another $400,000 in our budget, I don't know that there's anybody can say what the choice making will be at that time. But the more we care for one another, the more we're able to listen to each other, and the more we're able to be patient with each other, we will make the wiser choice at that time. But if we remain balkanized, if we remain stratified as organizations, it's impossible, I think, to make choices which we can all feel are legitimate. And in our organizations, many of our arts organizations are like little corporations. We have all the people with the power are here, and then there's people here, and then there's people here, and then there's the people who are actually doing the ground game. And so these stratifications we really reinforce because, the board meets together, the senior staff meets together, the other staff meet together. If it's an orchestra, the orchestra committee meets over here. The community engagement meets over here. So we have both stratified and siloized our organizations in such fascinatingly hermetic ways. that don't hold up when we have to make these kind of huge choices in times of such sustained uncertainty. So if anything, we need to just erase a lot of these lines that help us pretend that our organizations work in that way. So the stratification is going to be very costly, and the siloizing is going to be very costly unless we can sort of erase a lot of those lines that separate us. And you can have the smartest people in the world, running your departments, smartest people in the world, and the most dedicated people in the world. But in the world we're in now, that is insufficient. Human capital is not enough. You need really, really smart people who are really, really dedicated, who are connected to each other. It is the social capital, the social fabric in the organization that will move us through these times. It is not about what we know, because no one knows what we need to do next. We're going to have to create that from within the enterprise. There's no expert you can hire. There's no executive seasoned enough. We're going to have to figure this out. And the way to figure it out is to make sure that we've got really smart, really dedicated people who are connected to each other. And that means we need to erase these abstract lines that we've drawn that segregate us, I think, into stratification and also into the balkanized areas. So long-winded response, but just a thought.
Yeah, that's there's no magic bullet, and we have to be certain in our living in uncertainty in a way.
There's no magic bullet, but, and I know I'm repeating a bit of this, there's no magic bullet, but there is a means through which we work together.
Yeah.
Which is open, which is timely, which is courageous, which is porous. That will certainly contribute to better choices. Not a magic bullet, I think you're right, but it is a way of working that is distinct from you stay in your lane, I'll stay in my lane, they'll do their work over there. How do we come together as smart and dedicated people and actually create a set of choices which are in the best interest of the organization? And therefore, it's more about what we can learn from each other than what we've learned before this all started.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think the thing that I think is hard for the governance and the management of an organization is often trust, and it's often building a culture that's going to last. And in general, I see a lot of arts managers, and some of them are very, very eager, and they're very dedicated, and they'll come to an organization and they'll just perceive the musicians or the dancers or the actors in the company as very, very jaded, right? But the problem is that the performers are the elephants of the organization. Some of them will be there for 50 years. And so, you know, they may have had an executive director who wanted to come in and change the culture, and then that person left, and then somebody else came in and did the absolute opposite, right? Or whatever. And so there's this kind of built-in mistrust because of the way people connect to the organization, I think, in some ways. Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, this is not a direct answer to your question. I think it is easy for us to make it about the people. Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, that executive director came in and they did this, and it's, I'm not saying you're doing this, but it is easy to say, oh, they're at fault. Mm-hmm. My view is the structure is the problem, not the people who inhabit the different parts of the structure.
Because the structure can remain the same.
Yeah, a recent study that was done through the University of Chicago, through NORC at the University of Chicago, pulled together data from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences about who we as a society in the US value most. So, and the questions were something like, who is it you value a lot in our American society? And it was teachers and everybody from teachers to athletes to elected official to artists. Teachers, 77% of the American population who were surveyed, and I think the survey was done through Gallup, so it was done with some legitimacy, right? 77% value teachers a lot, 77%. 22% value artists a lot. And the only two categories below that were elected officials and athletes. I don't want to put that at the foot of artists. I want to put that we have created structures that actually inhibit the artists and the communities in which they're in working together. So, for example, this siloizing we've done, we used to back in the 80s and 90s, it was called outreach. And then we realized, oh, that's not really a good word because it's rather paternalistic, and we won't call it outreach anymore. We'll call it community engagement. And then we created departments of community engagement. So we got a department of community engagement over here someplace. But isn't that the job of the organization? We're 501c3, nonprofit, eleemosynary, charitable organizations, many of which garner 70% of their income from contributions. Isn't our job to engage the community? Not to create a department over here someplace and say, well, we do all our other stuff and we'll have a little department over here to do. So that creates a structure which guarantees that the artists in the community seldom engage in any way. And it's no wonder that society would value artists only 22%. That's only 1 in 5 people, when teachers are valued by 7 out of 10 people. So that's not at the foot of artists. That's out of these little corporations we've created that are not able within that structure to create the kind of dynamic, open, porous, reciprocal relationships between artists and their community.
That's really,
musicians, I know you're a musician. I work a lot with orchestras here and there. And if the relationship a community has with musicians is, I buy a ticket for $75. I pay $150 for 2 of them. That's a pretty inexpensive ticket these days. And I go to dinner, I go to the hall, I take my seat. There's a grand performance that I love it. And I leave and I go back to the parking garage and I go home. So why isn't that event considered and made manifest as community engagement? So we're going to have that very transactional thing happen. But over here, we've got another department that sort of goes shopping for parts of the community where we can do community engagement. So again, I think reconsidering and structuring the organization and recalibrating its responsibility to community is a way to make sure that artists and community, that the relationship is actually brokered by the organization as opposed to hindered by the organization.
Yeah, that's really perceptive and really insightful. And I feel like there's a certain tension with respect to artistic excellence, right? So if we're aiming for artistic excellence, then musicians are not vulnerable. Like, we don't want to show people our vulnerability, right? Like, artists, we're not out there. We're not bringing people into our rehearsal process because we have to wait till it's perfect before we show it to you. Is that part of the culture that needs to change as far as this idea of, for me, it's a vulnerability, right? It's like the idea that, oh, well, we're not transparent. We're very, very closed until it's time to present whatever it is that we're presenting from an artistic point of view.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know that the field is, in many places, this term excellence shows up. It shows up in so many mission statements as an example. We exist to do excellent work. Well, does anybody exist to do unexcellent work? I mean, it just sounds like a banner that we don't need to carry. I mean, does anybody really think we're not serious and earnest when we go into the rehearsal hall, when we hire musicians, the way you all practice the way you do? Who would think otherwise? So I think that, and it manifests itself in so many ways. I mean, we just saw over $500 million spent on Geffen Hall. I'm not here to judge whether we should spend over $500 million so that the infinitesimal sound is so perfect. I don't know. But I love your point about vulnerability, right? So, but I think about that money and I can think about other ways that could have been expensed. And I think about teaching artists and the work they do. And if I take the high schools across the 5 boroughs in New York and I start doing the math on $550 million, I can put people in touch with hour upon hour with artists and actually that can influence me as a 12, 14, 16-year-old forever in my life. So, but we make these choices about, quote, excellence, about quality, about the infinitesimally magnificent quality. And I don't know that they're the best choices, but I do think about being vulnerable, about being versatile, about being open, about being willing to try new ways of doing things where excellence may not be the banner that we're carrying. Maybe it's engagement. Maybe it's honesty. Maybe it's truth. Maybe it's vulnerability. But are there other values that we ought to be considering rather than considering that the one that starts most of the sentences in our mission statements?
Yeah, and I think having permission, especially if you're somebody, I mean, the first 2 years on a job, if you win a job with a major orchestra, let's say you're a performing musician, are just the most stressful, right? Because you don't have tenure and you're literally hanging on every note you play. But after you have some job security, it would be nice if the institutions would give people permission to be more creative, more vulnerable in their work, curate their own, concerts, or find ways to engage the community. Because I do think it's the artists that need to be part of that discussion as well.
Yes, I 1,000% support that. I mean, I think if you give 50 or 60 artists in an organization and those artists sit together, and I think they can sit together, and I'm in some of these conversations with people who are in the governance structure, the board, and also the staff. So imagine 30 people in a circle, and 10 of them are from the board, 10 from the staff, and 10 from the orchestra. And you sit and say, look, we want to have as open and candid a conversation. What's the point? What's the point of this $30 million thing? What is the point of it in the world that we currently reside in this city? What's the point? And we actually embrace that question. And then we say things like, okay, if that's the point, how do we begin to engage in a way that legitimately honors that point? And it may be a very different point than 1987 when the mission statement was created. So my view would be, what is the evolving purpose of an organization consistent with the way the world is shaping and shifting? What is the evolving purpose of the organization? Not how do we live up to this mission statement that 10 people crafted 40 years ago?
Right.
And that's madness. The world is changing. So what is the evolving purpose of this enterprise? And how do we need to work to achieve that? And how do we create an engagement with our community, which, yes, is led by artistry, but has a social impact, a civic impact, a spiritual impact, an educational impact that is consistent with the community as it finds itself? That, to me, is a richer conversation than how do we move this mission statement forward. Mission statements and strategic planning put together are a way to hermetically seal the status quo will not change. And we have to move away from that. We need strategy, but we don't need another strategic plan ever. We need strategy. And we need strategy to be in pursuit of our evolving purpose, not a strategic plan to hold onto our mission statement.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I remember working with you years ago, and you said, we don't need strategic plans, we need strategic thinking, which I thought was so resonant. But you still need to have a vision of where you want to go and where you want to be in 5 years, say, or 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And the vision, yes, vision and mission are so different. What is the vision we have for the community of which we're a part and has sustained us for 80 years? What vision do we have for this community we're in? And how do we see ourselves contributing to assuring that vision is realized? That's a really, really good question, because we are there as a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization to make sure there's a better community. That's the job. Or let's go into the marketplace and be a for-profit organization and compete with everybody else. But if we're going to take 60, 70% of our resources from the community as charitable contributions, our job is to create a better community. So what vision do we have for that role we can play in the community going forward? And if we have that vision of how we can do it, then we have these conversations about how might we reconstitute how we do things. And if you turn to a group of 50 or 60 musicians, and I've seen it happen in orchestras, and say, here's a thought exercise. If that were to be our place in the world that we're after, how can you imagine? Come back in a week and tell us how might you imagine our programmatic manifestation in that world. But we don't need to rely on often a music director who's with us 10 weeks a year to tell us what that should be. So yes, empowering artists is a way to move from society saying that only 22% of society saying that artists matter a lot. Let's empower them to reconstitute the kind of relationships that only they can think through.
Yeah, that's really important, I think. And I often think that artists aren't consulted enough on programming and mission and things like this. I want to thank Asha and Luther for commenting. If you're watching live, you can make a comment. I'll be happy to answer any questions we have for my guest, John, today. And so, John, I wanted to come back to a couple points, but the first one is, about David Geffen Hall. I mean, I'm really excited for it because I went to Avery Fisher, now David Geffen Hall, for years, and I know the orchestra is gonna transform the way they sound, and I think that's really important. But I also think that it's such an old model, right? The idea of building this kind of temple to the arts, making people come to it, and I think that paradigm is like, I'm just not sure anybody's going to spend $500 million again on a hall. I don't know. And of course, the history of Lincoln Center is so fraught because there was literally a community there that was destroyed so they could build these sort of monuments to the arts. And how do you see organizations breaking that mold of really taking the work to the community versus forcing everybody to come to this one monument?
Yeah, it's a good question. And at EMC Arts, again, I mentioned the organization. We had a 10-year relationship with the Doris Duke Foundation where we had something called the Innovation Lab for the Performing Arts. And then there was also an Innovation Lab for museums. So the idea was that the Doris Duke Foundation was going to fund organizations to actually think about those kind of questions. And the objective during the year in the lab was, and this was the phrasing we were using at the time, what are some small experiments you can make in pursuit of a radical intention? And what you've mentioned is a radical new relationship with our community. What are some small experiments you can take that would move your organization toward that radical intention? Well, I think the Denver Center Theater Company, Jiva Theater in New York, Dad's Garage in Atlanta, the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham. I watched a lot of organizations do profoundly intriguing and learningful experiments. And I think some of them moved a bit in that direction. However, philanthropy has changed a lot since that time. So 3 indicators of how philanthropy has changed. One is, for the first time ever, less than 50% of American households make charitable contributions. Less than 50%. It was 66% only 8 years ago.
Wow.
It used to be that of American philanthropy, the arts got 13%. Now it gets 4%.
Oh.
A recent survey of foundations, of the 428 largest foundations, asked about critical priorities. 4 of those foundations named the arts as one of their critical priorities. 4, that's less than 1 in 100 foundations. So when you talk about this new relationship and David Geffen Hall and the big hall, I would say when an orchestra says, and I'm not picking on orchestras, theater company, fill in the blank. We're working with Miami City Ballet. We work with the theater company. So I know you're from the orchestra world, right?
Yeah.
When an orchestra says, our budget is going from 30 million to 8 million. We're going to close our hall and shutter it. And from now on, we show up in high school auditoriums and gyms. We show up at the YMCA. We show up at Boys and Girls Club. And we show up in churches and faith communities. And to work with us, it'll cost you between $5 and $35. And if you want to work here, that's the deal. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can incrementalize ourselves there. because philanthropy has become impatient with the arts saying they were going to diversify. That was back in the 80s when I first started working as a consultant. Diversity was sort of first coming onto the scene. And we've been at this now for 40 some years. And I'm in enough rooms. And the last week, I've been in Cleveland, in Minneapolis, in Syracuse, and Miami. And I'm in those rooms where there's 10 people, 40 people, 90 people. And I see one or two non-white people in those rooms. That's just like I saw it in 1987. And I've been complicit in probably sustaining that order, right? But philanthropy they're woefully tired of our talk.
That's interesting. I all of us in the arts who are artists just assume people just don't care about us, and that's why they're not giving to us. But you're saying there's a connection between our lack of maybe perhaps contemporizing our relevance and our engagement and our diversity and inclusion, that's a factor in that. And that's something I hadn't considered. But I agree with you. I mean, we had in my orchestra here in Las Vegas, I understood the choices, but I didn't necessarily love it. But, last year coming out of the pandemic, it's like, well, we don't know what we're going to be able to put on stage, what we can do. So let's do a Beethoven cycle, and we'll do a new piece by a woman composer on each concert. And it was fine, but I just think the world does not need another Beethoven cycle. And I remember in Beethoven's anniversary year, a couple of years ago, Carnegie Hall was bragging about, all these orchestras of the world, and they were going to have 3 Beethoven cycles. And I'm just like, the world does not need this. Like, this is so tired and so, not creative in terms of programming. And how do we get those new voices in a way that doesn't seem like we're playing catch up and being tokenistic about it, I guess.
And I think you nailed it right at the beginning of what you said. It is making choices we do not want to make. I understand totally a board member, an executive, or a musician saying, but wait a minute, we've got all these patrons who give us a lot of money. And that's what they want to see. And they've been coming for years. And sometimes just because things have changed doesn't mean anything is different. And I think that's the cycle we've been in, is tweaking, and letting the tweaking basically stand in for real fundamental change. And we can't have everything we have and actually change. So we're going to have to disrupt. We're going to have to interrogate the structure. We're going to have to interrogate priorities. We're going to have to interrogate the system. And when we do that, I think we begin to discover some things that we have to leave behind if we want to be legitimately relevant, not just say in our end of the year brochure we're relevant because the pictures, are now showing that we're relevant. But the map is not the territory. The picture is not the reality. So giving up the things that we have held dear for so long is going to be required in order to make any change of any substance. In other words, it goes back to what my dad used to say, wait a minute, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
And I think for a long time we thought we could. And I understand the logic and the yearning for that, but we can't have it both ways. And again, I am not a social scientist. I am not a futurist. We are never, ever, ever going back to the way it used to be. That has never happened in the history of the cosmos. Change is going to continue, and it is going to speed up. So if we think that it's going to get settled to where we can sort of have the old order again, pretty much the way it was, I see no evidence, and I find no person out there who looks at questions like that who would endorse that as a way of thinking. So I think we have 3 fundamental choices. Either shut down and say it's been a great run, and for 40 years, look at what we created. Let's celebrate 4 decades of service, of mutuality with our community, and let's celebrate that and shut down. Or let's put our nose to the grindstone and let's push on, knowing that this is going to settle down at some point. Or the third choice is shape and shift the way the world is shaping and shifting. It is that fundamental. But I don't think you can be sort of in between those and say, well, we'll sort of do some of this, we'll sort of do some of that. So that's why I tell the story about going from 30 million to 8 million, shuttering the hall, going out there. And then we won't need a community engagement department. That'll be what we do. That's what we live for. That's what our purpose is, right? So we can throw away the old mission statement and say our purpose is to engage our community and to co-create with our community meaningful moments where music and the power of music is actually altering the way we exist in our communities. But that's very different than the world as it is that we might feel like we want to push forward. In those three choices, none of those are better than the other. And I am not proposing an organization do one or the other. I'm saying there are consequences to each of the three. And I do believe we're at a moment where fundamentally, where philanthropy is, where the uncertainty is, and I think where the needs of the world, and not only the needs of the world, the demands of our society, just take justice. Just justice. Justice means access to resources. It means access to experiences. So we're either part of creating greater justice or we're not. You can't sort of be both. So,
yeah, I think that's so true. And this idea of engagement and really being part of a community. It's not even engaging; it's being the community. I want to say. And I was thinking back to my dear friend Maria, who passed away a few years ago, maybe just last year. We toured together years ago, and when 9/11 happened, she and her colleagues went down and they played string quartet music for all of the workers. It was not something that they got paid for. It was something that they did because they said they needed to do it. And unfortunately, she had some respiratory issues resulting from that. But she was transformative in that she was the only, or perhaps the first. She was the first musician to get relief from the fund of supporting those workers who were damaged by those things. And I love that example because it was so impactful and so powerful to think about.
Oh, that's very powerful.
Yeah. So somebody said it's terrible that the arts in this country are not supported as they should be. And I think that's right. But I think you're highlighting some things about how much of that is our responsibility. And I think we haven't really done that kind of deep dive and investigation.
I don't see the comments, but just a paraphrase of that. Why aren't the arts support, or it's too bad the arts aren't supported the way they should be?
Yeah.
I mean, that carries some set of assumptions about how they should be supported, right? But I think when you do, again, I want to go back to this survey. I talked about sort of how philanthropy is changing. But if only 1 in 5 persons in America says that the artists matter a lot, and 7 out of 10 say that, I actually printed this off this morning, that teachers and I don't want to misread this, so I'll turn on the light because I think this is important. Teachers, scientists, doctors, faith leaders, college professors, all these are in the 50 to 70 to 80% of Americans saying these matter a lot. 22% artists, 20% elected officials, and 14% professional athletes. If that's the case, and that's what people are saying, I don't know if it's on the other side of that we can say, but I wish art were supported the way they should be. I think we have to carve out a new place in our communities.
Yeah.
Because it saddens me to look at it because I spend so much time with musicians, with actors, with designers, some with visual artists, with dancers who have such short careers. They don't want this. So I think rather than say the artists don't matter, it's the structures we have. So many of the organizations that I encounter, the prevailing narrative and the energy in those organizations is basically about survival. And Peter Sellers, the wonderful director, artistic gadfly, 40 years ago, I picked him up at National Airport. He was running the Adelaide Festival in Australia, and we had invited him to come in to speak to 250 people at the National Endowment for the Arts. And Peter, in the back of my car, is spending the night with us. He said, John, what's on the mind of all these people that you've got together tomorrow from these arts organizations? And I said, Peter, this was like in the 90s sometime, one of the 90s downturns. I said, Peter, I think most of these people are it's about survival. And he gave that inimitable Peter Sellers laugh. And he said, survival may be necessary, but it is just not very interesting. And so many organizations right now they're fighting to survive. And I would argue two things: reimagine the relationship with your community and make very hard choices, or strength by merging with another organization. Part of our practice is mergers, right? I'm not in here to say people should call us to help them merge. But when I look at, for example, two mergers, Renew Media and the Tribeca Film Festival, when they merged, they created the Tribeca Film Institute, which is a powerhouse of service to filmmakers and to audiences for film, because the festival is just grand. The Bill T. Jones Dance Company and Dance Theater Workshop. Bill T. is one of the world's great artists.
Oh, yeah.
He had no home. He's just traveling around the world hoping to get a 6-week residency so he can create a new piece. He now has a home at Dance Theater Workshop. Dance Theater Workshop was a building that was debt-ridden and empty a good part of the time. Now, New York Live Arts, which came out of that merger, is a powerful, robust organization. It's not that we've got too many arts organizations. We need stronger organizations who don't have to focus all their narrative, all their energy on survival, that can do these things we've been talking about for the last 46 minutes, which is engage the community in a new and different way. And if all of our conversations are not about survival, but are about that, then I think we actually can change these numbers from 22% to a higher number over the next decade.
Yeah, that's so true. I have two things that I want to touch on, but the first one is, I couldn't agree with you more about survival. And when I was back more in the management side of things, 10 or so years ago now, more actually, people were talking about, needing a sustainable model. We need to change the model so it's sustainable. And I just remember thinking that is the most depressing way to look at the arts that I can think of. Because first of all, there's nothing sustainable. It's always going to cost more money than you're going to make. So you can't sustain it. You have to make it essential, and you have to make it something that's exciting that people want to be part of, I think. Like that to me is what we need to focus on. And you're right, survival is not something that you can fundraise on, I don't think, or engage the communities around.
Yes, it's such a limp, L-I-M-P, limp case. Help us stay around for another year.
Yeah.
Who's going to fund that?
Yeah.
Who's going to fund help? So, but Michael, we brought this on ourselves. We sort of pretend we're in the marketplace. So we sell as many tickets as we can. This is old philanthropy. Sell as many tickets as we can. Then there's a gap. And we go out to our funders and says, we couldn't quite fill the gap, so we need you to come in to help us. That is a subsidy model, because we're not quite cutting it in the marketplace, so we need you to come in and subsidize us.
Yeah.
When you were talking about earlier about vision, you go to your funder and say, that's the vision we have for our community. And that's the role we're going to play. And these are the 4 ways we're going to do it. Invest in that. So you move from a subsidy model to an investment model. So you're exactly right. Survival is not a fundable outcome.
Yeah. And I work on the labor side of things now. And, I think that subsidy model is so toxic, because what it does is it makes, the leaders in the field, and their boards, it's like, well, the art and the actual, mission, I wouldn't say product, I would say the mission is the musicians or the dancers or the actors or, whoever. And if you have that subsidy model, you get into the mindset of, well, we have to cut their pay, right? Because they're just a red line now on our budget, versus they're essential, they're the mission, and the approach to compensation and money and all of those things becomes a much different thing. It's not that you're automatically going to get paid more. It's not that you're not going to have disagreements about that and tough negotiations. But, when you come to artists with this idea that you're just a necessary evil that we have to pay for, which comes, I think, from that subsidy model, it creates those toxic environments where you do get those fights, And I remember, speaking of a toxic situation, like the Minnesota Orchestra years ago, it was such a glaring example, right? Where they'd spent all this money on a new hall, but then they were fighting with their orchestra around what they were going to pay. And it's like, well, you just invested in bricks, but you don't want to invest. Like, that's how it felt looking at it from afar. I'm sure there was other truths in there that I'm not, the nuances, but I think that's so important. The thing that I really was disturbed by what you just said about the statistics you read, which I don't follow a lot of that, but I should. It's really fascinating, right? The way you're looking at philanthropy and how it's being tracked, is that I consider artists teachers and spiritual leaders. So if those people are up here and we're down here, like, what is wrong? Where's the disconnect happening?
Well, I think part of it is in the messaging. You mentioned excellence before. I'm not anti-excellence, by the way. But if the outcome we're going for is ritualized excellence, it ignores those other ways in which we can contribute, by creating social capital in our communities, by creating civic capital in our communities, by creating educational capital in our communities. So, but it depends on what we emphasize. It's like a theater company say, we exist to make sure theater artists can be paid a living wage. Well, if the Cleveland Clinic were to say, we exist to make sure we can pay doctors a living wage, I'm sorry, Cleveland Clinic exists to help people live longer.
Right.
To help eradicate disease, but not, just imagine if part of their mission statement, we exist to pay doctors and scientists a living wage. No, we exist for the output that those people create, which is value in the world, which is we cure this, these people live longer, whatever those societal benefits are. But we seldom talk about those. We talk about what we do, not the outcome of what we do that we're looking for, which is a better and stronger community, a more civil society. I don't see arts organizations talking about those things. And my sense is, and I'm just making a guess, that's why philanthropists can easily give up on us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's not that we don't want artists to make a living wage, but that's a side effect, right, of doing the other work if you're doing it really well, right? And you're making that impact. But you're right, it is about impact, and looking at like entrepreneurship and thinking about how people engage with services or with consultants, people like you, or with products. They want to know how the product's going to improve their life or how the experience is going to impact them. They don't care about the experience, right? Like, your resume is not as valuable as the outcomes that you create. And I think that's what you're saying about the arts as well.
Yeah, I think so. And particularly, I think for the biggie organizations like the big theater company, the big orchestra, the big museum, if we really do look in relative terms to the investment the community makes. So let's say it's a $50 million museum, and the community over 10 years has invested, let's say, $40 million a year. And let's just round up a little bit. That's $1 billion investment over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
I better be able to see how the community is better off because I've made that investment.
Absolutely.
So museums, as an example, at any given time, a museum can exhibit somewhere between 2 and 6% of what it owns. Then why isn't every classroom, every law office, every restaurant, why isn't there artwork everywhere? And the museum is facilitator of engagement with the world's best art, as opposed to a place with locked doors and guards where you get to come in and see 2% of what they've got. And they decide what that is. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's crazy. And you're right. I think it's this idea that we make everybody come to us versus how do we come to everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm engaged with an organization called the Making Music Matter Foundation. It's a very long name, here in Henderson and in Las Vegas, Nevada. And we have the advantage of being tiny, not having a lot to work with, but we also have no, a 40-year history of a mission or a vision that we're locked into. And so I'm really excited to think about taking some of these ideas and saying, how do we look at the impact that we're making? And what I like about it is that it's a whole ecosystem where we have some educational work with a youth band, a summer camp, and some performing organizations. And we have people that are teachers in the community who play in the ensemble, who also teach at the band camp. We have students who came through the band camp who are now in the ensemble, who are now teachers. So it's all this ecosystem, which I find so exciting, because a lot of times, we get, especially with the large organizations, right? You have musicians who audition, and it's extremely competitive. People don't realize how competitive it is to get a job like in the New York Philharmonic. And they do that 52 weeks a year, and that's what they do. And I wanted to come back to one point you made before we close, which is that artistic excellence is important, but there are all these other things. And I think that the disconnect that happens with artists, especially classical musicians, right, is that they're only hired for artistic excellence. It's the one criteria they're hired for, and so you don't have a way to, it affects how we look at inclusion, it affects how we look at diversity, it affects how we look at all these other things, because if there are these 20 skills that you need somebody to have, but you're only looking at this one when you hire them, how do you then reverse engineer everything else? Or is there a change in that model that needs to happen? And how do we do that given the relationships of employment and hiring and processes that are in place?
Well, I'll speak first to your own organization there, and how beautiful that sounds, and how elegant a relationship I think you already have and can have with your community, and that dialogic capability that all organizations have, but yours can really take advantage of. So I think there was a world once where really smart people in organizations made decisions and then delivered stuff to their community. We're doing this for our community. I mean, just think about the language. That's pretty paternalistic. So instead of designing and delivering, what about working with community, co-create, and then co-engage around that? So if we ask our communities questions, it's not that they're going to come back and say, oh, I want you to do more Beethoven and more Mozart. If that's what they talk about, then we've asked the wrong question. There's a way to ask questions, a way to frame questions within our community that open up a way for them to begin to inform our own choices, because they are made on behalf of those very people. So we've got to get better at asking really good, focused, yet open questions that don't lead to these reductive responses like do more Beethoven and Mozart. No, they're going to help us understand our place in the world. But if we don't engage them about our place in the world, we're sitting in our offices or in a rehearsal hall deciding it ourselves. That's craziness. So this dialogic piece, I think, is very important. Your second one about the hiring, if I go back to this just thought exercise, so we're going to go from 30 million to 8 million, we're going to shutter the hall, and we're going to show up in these 4 places, and ticket prices are going to do these, then people know before they audition for you what they're in for. And I think a lot of times people don't know what they're in for, because we're sort of going to do this, but we're sort of going to hold on to this, right? So I think one thing is just making a declaration of what our institution stands for in the world and how we're going to make that manifest. And so before you audition there, if you audition for a chair in the orchestra, that it's not going to be 14 weeks of performance on the main stage, 6 weeks of classics and 8 weeks of pops. It is going to be something very different. And we describe that to people. And the people who don't want that, then don't audition there, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong, by the way, with pops and masterworks or classics. The question I heard the other day when I was in Syracuse they said, whose classics? And it just hit me right here. Whose classics?
That's really profound.
Just wow. So we can learn a lot from our community if we just ask the right questions, well framed questions, and we just be really quiet and listen. I'll close by just quoting Michael Rohde, ROHD. Michael Rohde was a student of mine, although he had another tutor as well at Virginia Tech. He went off to found Sojourn Theater in Oregon. He's now at Northwestern. And Michael came as one of the keynote speakers at the League of American Orchestras conference 8 years ago, maybe 10, when it was held in Cleveland. I don't know what year that was. And he posed this question: when will we in our organizations begin to listen to our communities with the same amount of attention we demand of them when they listen to us? And I'd never heard it put better. So I just want to give Michael credit for that. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me in here too.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John. And I was just thinking about the 2% you were talking about with the art in the museum. And I was thinking about, the way, again, like these big institutions like Cleveland or New York have these musicians, and we're seeing 2% of what they do on stage. Imagine if they took 2 of their services a week and were put in a school, let's say, something like that. It's really getting my brain turning. So I could easily talk to you for another hour, but I want to thank you so much for coming. And how do people find you if they want to connect with you or learn more about what you do?
It would be easy. Just partnersinperformance.us, partnersinperformance.us. And I always am looking for new people to talk to because I learn so much in every one of those conversations. And I don't know who's logged in or who might log in later, but just partnersinperformance.us. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. And people will watch live. We got a few watchers now, which is always great. And then you can always hear the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Audible later. And I hope you'll come back again, John, because I feel like we've hit on some really, really fertile ground that I would love to continue the conversation around.
Sounds great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and we'll see you all next week.